part 4 of things, of the Basis 70. And we were getting all hot and bothered. Well, we weren't really. We were getting very excited, very detailed about the space program and about why we can't live out there. We can't actually work out there. But there are some people who are, some guy who owns Facebook, or is it Amazon? And another guy who drives very nice cars. He sent one into space. Think otherwise. They're putting a lot of money into that. I mean, what do you feel? Are they actually? Does anybody not told them that it doesn't work?
Well, I mean, I'm a science fiction devotee like anyone else. I also happen to like cars. One of my books, called Ghost Rides, is actually what I call an automobiography, since it was an attempt at a sort of good-humored autobiography of myself that's sort of based on all the exotic automobiles I've owned over the years. I've had Ferraris, Maseratis, Lotai.
Lotai?
And, of course, the plural of Lotus.
Of course.
Or what, at one point Colin Chapman was asked, what does the word lotus mean? And Jim Clark, his world champion driver, popped up and says, lots of trouble, usually serious.
That's very true, but it's a dreadful thing to say, but it's true. Well, hand-built with care and love.
He could get away with it as his champion driver at the time. But in any case, and of course, one of my loves is Aston Martin. I've had a couple of DB7s and a Vantage V8 S, my latest true love. So I'm very passionate about those, and a longtime member of the Aston Martin Owners Club over in the UK also.
Well, I have to say, the best I can do is
games,
a Toyota Supra. The best I can do is Supras. It's Japanese.
Perfectly fine. Hey, whatever is fun.
Yeah.
And I'm not overly wealthy either, but I've simply been on the watch during my life for good opportunities to get my hands on some interesting automotive creations, and some very unusual ones. At one point, I think it was Tom Walkinshaw was hired by Jaguar in its old days to spruce things up, and he created an outfit called Jaguar Sport, which was sort of a UK version of Carroll Shelby and his Cobra operation over here. And so Tom Walkinshaw created some Jaguar Sport versions of the old XJS called the XJRS, and he sent 50 of them over to the United States, and naturally I had to get one. So I've sort of been around the block. This goes all the way back to the 1960s when I walked into a Lincoln Mercury dealership in Santa Barbara, which couldn't sell at that time the British Ford Cortinas because nobody seemed to want them. But they had a very funny one in the back. It was all white with a little green stripe on it. And they said, this is a Lotus Cortina, but we don't know anything else about it. And I says, well, I do, because I watched The Avengers, and it has the same engine that Emma Peel has in her Lotus Elan, so give me that.
Wow.
Anyway, so that's how I got started on that particular drug addiction. But you were talking about space.
Yeah, the lack of it. I mean,
the
Saturn V, the whole aspect of that launch, there's a lot of stuff about that now. And, of course, we're dealing with the 50th, is it the 50th anniversary of the moon landings? The Apollo 11, a really great film that's been out there.
I mean, the supposed moon landings, the fake moon landings, anyway.
Why are they faked? Explain that.
Oh, well, I mean, we were in a propaganda war with we being the USA was in a propaganda war with the Soviet Union as to who can conquer space better and faster, and we kept getting eclipsed by them. They had the first man into space, they had the first Sputnik, they had Yuri Gagarin, they had the first dog, they had
the first woman.
Yeah. I mean, so they kept doing the first of everything. And so John Kennedy said, well, damn it, we're going to get to the moon first before they do. So he gave NASA marching orders to get to the moon first. And very soon, NASA realized that couldn't happen. But what they couldn't do in reality, we had this great faking capability here in the United States. We're, the psyop and movie-making capital of the world. So you can make almost anything in those days. But a lot of the film technology they had back then was okay back then, but it today you can find your way through it. You know, you can disassemble this stuff. You can freeze frame stuff, which is why, for example, the fake film for the 9/11 has now been pulled apart and is shown to be all CGI. Whereas when it was shown on TV, you know, the normal viewer doesn't see that. But in any case, you know, going back to the moon landings and so on, I think like everybody else in 1969, I was in special forces in Vietnam, busy fighting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and stuff, and I didn't have a lot of time to pay attention to the moon, but I did hear that we'd actually landed on the sucker, so I said, whoa, that's cool, the United States actually got to the moon. And I believed it. I just took it for granted. And it wasn't until some decades later that the stories that first seemed to be kind of conspiracy theory silliness began to show some substance to them, and then it became even more serious and more serious to the point where, well, okay, we can't ignore this anymore, you know, because of the radiation issues and so on. For example, I listened to and you can find this stuff on YouTube if you go and look for it. There was a professional photographer who, he works with cameras and film at the professional level, and he knows the cameras. He's worked with those specific cameras that the astronauts had on the front of their suits, which supposedly were just regular cameras. The only thing is that they didn't have the sighting mechanisms on them for the obvious reason that the astronauts couldn't look down through a viewfinder from their helmets. So they were just forced to take sort of what was in front of them, photographs, which makes it kind of interesting that they got all these perfectly posed photos. But in any case, the cameras, supposedly, they were using just their ordinary kind of film that they use here on Earth. And that sounds okay until you start to think of the fact that the temperature on the lunar day is red hot boiling, and the temperature in the lunar night is really sub-zero freezing. And normal photographic film can't handle that kind of stuff. It operates in a very narrow range where its chemicals can function, and the film would just crack and become completely wasted, not to mention the fact that the cameras had no radiation protection whatever, and they're bathed in all this solar radiation, which would have resulted, if the film had functioned, in just simply overexposed pieces of nothing. So how do you get this good film? And he said, well, I don't know. He says, but you couldn't have done it with these cameras or with any other cameras that we had at the time. We didn't have anything, you know, like that. So once you find out that all that camera footage stuff is faked, and then you start coming up with all the other peripheral information, like the fact that these same radiation problems would have fried the astronauts, and the fact that
I think if you look at the Viking lander, it didn't use an optical lens. It has a single-line scanner, almost like a fax machine, they didn't have an optical lens.
Yeah. So, the amount of faux pas that have been detected and discovered about the moon landings, the whole Apollo program from 11 through 17, is now at the slapstick level, because they've found so many goofs and so many props that were left lying around, among the rocks and at the astronauts' feet and so on. The fact that the same lunar lander buggy, was reused a couple of times with a few repairs on it, and show with an oil leak when nothing would be leaking in that environment or that atmosphere because of the same liquid issues. And it just kind of goes on and on and on to the point where you say, okay, well, it's kind of ridiculous to want any further proofs, because obviously the whole thing was done on a soundstage here. And the real astronauts were probably shot up into a near-Earth orbit, sailed around in it for 2 or 3 days, and then came back down to Earth, same as in the Mercury or Gemini program.
And there's a very interesting new book, which it's a Nexus magazine, where there's a continuous, all the video on YouTube is cut between different launches. There's not a single continuous shot. But this guy who actually wanted to record it because he was absolutely into Apollo, and he ran continuous shot right up as the Apollo 11 launch vehicle got through the cloud layer, but it got through the cloud layer late, and based on the figures working on how long it took and why it was a good few seconds, 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds late going through that cloud layer, because he knew the height of it. It barely got to
Well,
orbit.
even-
It barely got to
yeah,
orbit at all.
I mean, even people like von Braun said it's ridiculous to think that the Saturn, had enough rocket fuel in it to go all the way to the moon and all the way back. And I mean, as I said, the more you look at it, the sillier it gets. I mean, the astronauts were wearing these suits for several days. Well, what did they do with their poop? Okay. Anyway, you get to the.
I think they said they had low residuals. I think they said they had low residuals.
Yeah, well, you get to orbit the moon from the command module, and then supposedly the lunar lander breaks loose from that and goes down to the surface. And then using its one little rocket, it comes up again. How's it supposed to match up with this multi-thousand mile an hour base ship that's orbiting the moon? How's it supposed to catch up to it perfectly? To find it, to catch up with it and dock it, its one little rocket isn't going to take it from a stationary surface on the moon and suddenly get it up to several thousand miles an hour and have a perfect matchup with the base.
Well, astronaut Ken Johnston, my own namesake, and I've met him a couple of times. He was meant to be speaking at a major conference here in the United Kingdom about the whole Apollo thing, and he's been pulled. In fact, I was going to have an interview with him, and he sent me a whole PowerPoint presentation, and he then suddenly said, you can't use that, and he was explaining how there's a balloon on the surface taken by some other mechanism where they show that there's an atmosphere in the moon. I mean, that's what John Lear is talking about. There's an atmosphere. There's a completely different... the moon is nothing like what we're told, in other words.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the surface of the moon is fairly well known as to what's there and so on. But the photographs, as I said, are impossible to have been taken because of the limitations of the camera and the film, from those days. And maybe today, when you're not using camera film, but you're using kind of electronic recording stuff like we do with our iPhones, that might have been different. But we didn't have that then. Those were regular cameras. They could not have functioned with that film in that environment, period. I mean, that kind of is a deal closer right there.
Okay, so what's the psyop?
So in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Okay, so in terms of space, in general, just, again, to throw out a few credentials here, I'm one of the Army's, among other things, I was one of the Army's first space intelligence officers, because the U.S. Army created its space intelligence program to join up with those of the Air Force and the Navy in 1990. And I was in the intelligence branch at the time, and I was selected to be one of the first space intelligence officers for the Army. The Army created its own space institute at the time, but it didn't even have any classes yet. It was so new. So it actually sent me through the Air Force Joint Space Intelligence course in Colorado Springs at Peterson Air Force Base, where I was taking the course for Joint Space Intelligence Operations along with the Air Force, the NSA, and CIA and other people like that, and the National Reconnaissance Office people. I then spent from 1990 to 1994 as a Space Intelligence Officer at Headquarters U.S. Space Command, Colorado Springs, which is the U.S. headquarters agency that oversees the U.S. participation in NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, that is a joint command with Canada and operates mostly out of Cheyenne Mountain. So our command at headquarters at Peterson basically was the over-command for the Cheyenne Mountain activities.
And that's where they have the Stargate. And
oh, you bet your ass.
And also, obviously, since nothing's actually happening in space.
About that.
Yeah, well, obviously, since there's nothing actually happening in space and Apollo didn't happen, what did you do in all those years? I mean, in all those colleges and all those agencies. I mean, what's really out there?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what we did at Space Command at NORAD, which was the original mission of NORAD was, of course, to use radar technology to keep an eye on the Earth's atmosphere and hyperatmosphere over the poles, because if we or Canada were going to be attacked by missiles from the Soviet Union, the NORAD was what was supposed to see them coming.
Okay, well, let's face it, all that nuclear war stuff.
Now you move forward. Yeah, so now you move forward to 1990. You move forward to 1990, and what's NORAD doing? What's the U.S. Space Command doing? Well, it boils down to basically two things. One is satellite intelligence. We controlled and operated through the National Reconnaissance Office all of the satellite intelligence programs of the United States. The code area for this above top secret was TK, or talent keyhole, as it was called. So if you had a top secret clearance like I did, then you would have to have special compartmented access for talent keyhole if you were involved in the satellite intelligence stuff.
Just briefly, there was a major book written by Donald Keyhole. Was that a code for the same sort of thing on UFOs?
Well, I'm not. I think that's keyhole, H-O-E, but now talent's keyhole. That's like a K-E-Y-H-O-L-E. Those are just code words, and that was the code suffix, as I said, for the satellite intelligence program. So my orders, for example, would read in my security area, they would say TS/TK. Or in my case, I had an additional one, which was MJ. So it would say TS/TK/MJ.
Is MJ for
MJ
majestic?
Yes, actually, I mean that wasn't the original name, although that was one of the spin-off names in popular culture that happened. But MJ was just the original compartment for the part of U.S. space intelligence activities that was concerned with the contingency possibilities of any kind of extraterrestrial life form, and it would be closer to a scenario more like the Andromeda strain than it would be from, Mars attacks Earth kind of thing, because you were really more worried about the chance situations that would have from biological organisms that would come down here than, little green men and flying saucers and stuff. But so I was the MJ officer at J2 headquarters, U.S. Space Command, which meant that anything that NORAD picked up at Cheyenne Mountain that seemed anomalous and wasn't just simply normal aircraft and spacecraft screwing around would basically come over my desk for an opinion. Do we have to worry about this or not? And if we have to worry about it, you can pick up a phone and call somebody who's got stars on his shoulders, and we'll get excited about this. If not, then we'll just shrug it off as stuff. And by stuff, I mean that people tend to think of space, including orbital space, as a big empty area. Well, it isn't. It's a trash heap. It's full of space junk, which is all the accumulated crap from all the launches that we and the Soviet Union and everybody else have had over the years. The junk from this is all floating around up there, and once in a while, some of it will, come in and crash back to Earth. But it's usually burned up in the atmosphere, so it doesn't hit anybody on the head. But there's an enormous amount of crap up there, in addition to which you've got a lot of meteors, meteorites, and just general shit, that's up there in space that's impacting the Earth or near missing it, most of which, as I said, is burned up or deflected by our atmospheric layers. All that stuff is picked up on Cheyenne Mountain and the NORAD sensors, and anything which didn't make sense, this would come across my desk with a little MJ tag on it saying, take a look at this, Colonel Aquino, and see if there's anything we need to worry about. So that was MJ. I mean, to connect it a little bit, you have the suffix that happened just after it was the famous MK series after MJ, and the MK was like MK Ultra and MK Naomi and all that kind of stuff. But that was a whole different area.
Yeah, that's mind control.
The MK was
psychotronic mind control.
But that was the MK suffix, and the MJ had to do, as I said, with the extraterrestrial stuff. So that was where that came from. But there was no magic organization, like some Men in Black thing, as much as it was just a number of people in the MJ field who were paying attention to what was out there to make sure that nothing came up and bit us in the ass, like the Andromeda strain kind of things.
Well, what about the Russians? I'm going to just interrupt there. The Russians, Valery Uvarov, in Russia, this thing that came in early 20th century, there's talking about an Earth defense system, an ancient Earth defense system to actually deal with that stuff. And it's operated recently, and the other information is that the weapon system it uses to deal with this kind of stuff is running out of ammunition, and if any of that stuff does get anywhere near the surface and lands, there are secondary stuff, things which really annihilate that stuff.
Well, I wouldn't
what about
put
the Russians?
Much credibility in that.
Well,
I wouldn't put much credibility in that because if you've got a big meteor that's going to hit the Earth, there's nothing that's going to really stop it. I mean, you'd have to. You can't.
Well, I'm referring to those things which did blow up at 80 miles up, caused huge damage, Tunguska, and actually the start of the 21st century.
If you've got a big enough meteor and it hits the Earth, it'll do a lot of damage, and that's happened several times in our history.
And one came in almost recently over Australia, this Planet X debris field. What about all that? Mm-hmm. It's going to be coming really close to us.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with that specific thing anymore. Again, my assignment to U.S. Space Command was 1990 to 1994. So I've been out of the government actively, since that time. I can just tell you what I was doing.
Yeah, but you must. Michael, surely you play golf occasionally with some of your current colleagues, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, let's just say that I haven't had anybody call me on the phone and say, put your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye because there's something on the way to hit us. So I'm not aware of anything that, that's a big danger like that.
Well,
right
on
now.
the psychic warfare front, Colonel Ed Dames, what about his work? I mean, this is the psychic warfare stuff, the remote viewers, the kill shot effect. Something's going to come close.
Okay.
What about all that stuff?
Yeah, if your listeners or your readers want the honest to God, actual factual story of what can and can't be done with the brain, you want to pick up my book called Mind War, MINDWAR, which is available on Amazon both in the UK and the USA, and it goes into a great deal concerning brain architecture and how the mind functions and how your thoughts function, and what can be done through artificial means to influence or control any part of this action. And it also has, of course, a brief history of some of the rather silly-ass things that have been attempted by people like the CIA in the past when they were screwing around with stuff like MK Ultra, which was an absolute idiotic abortion of a plan. Which if they
Michael,
you're
being unkind to a fellow agency.
Yeah, aren't I? Sorry about that, But I mean, I wrote a paper at one point called, Project Stargate, which was the later CIA government program concerning all that remote viewing claptrap that was going on. I called it Project Stargate, $20 million up in smoke and mirrors, which is exactly what it was. Let me tell you, here's another one of my credentials, all right? I'm a Magician Life member of the Magic Castle in Hollywood. That's sort of the U.S. version of what you have in the U.K. as the Magic Circle, which is the preeminent association of stage magicians. That's where you learn how to, for purely entertainment purposes, that's how you learn to control what people see and hear and believe in a close-up or in a stage setting, whether you're David Copperfield or whether you're just doing close-up stuff. In any case, it all has to do with the same thing as the manipulation of what people see and hear and think that they believe to be real. So one of the things that we do at Fort Bragg is basically to give people our PSYOP officers, we give them a crash course in, what the Magic Castle is all about, so that they understand how this stuff can be done, and they learn about it on in a non-lethal, kind of entertaining kind of way. But the principles are actually the same, except that when you use this stuff on a macro level and you're using it against large populations, then you're not doing it for entertainment purposes. You're doing it for control purposes, and obviously you're not telling them that all this is just for fun or something. So people like Uri Geller, he was just a stage magician from Israel. That's all. James Randi, from the Magic Castle, poked holes in his whole operation from day one, and none of us considered it, worth a damn at all. I still remember on one of my early visits to the Magic Castle, I was talking to one of the house magicians there, and I said, "Oh, Uri Geller bent spoons," and he said, "Oh, hell, anybody can do that." He said, "You got a quarter?" So I tossed him a quarter, and he held it up in his fingers a few minutes, and he massaged it, and then he tossed it back to me, and it was bent 90 degrees. And I said, "Oh, you palmed it and substituted another one." He looked at me really hurt and indignant, and he said, "I did not. I'll prove it to you. Give me your car keys." And I said, "I believe you."
Yeah. But I mean, all this stuff, about psychotronic weapons, all that sort of kind of thing.
So the guy who wrote the book on this was another Army colonel, good friend of mine named John Alexander. He's written several books in non-lethal
and I've
warfare.
interviewed him, and I think he's not too happy that I interviewed him, but I interviewed him a while ago.
Well, yeah, okay. He's another old friend of mine, nice guy, full Army colonel. He's also a Green Beret like me, so he's been around the block. He got interested in non-lethal stuff. The problem with non-lethal stuff is it does do damage to people. It just doesn't kill them. And if you have people using it irresponsibly, you just wind up with a lot of people who you've done some serious physiological damage to and blown out their eardrums or whatever. That's not too good either. I mean, his problem was not in coming up with a prescription for non-lethal stuff. It was the doctrines that have to do with people using this responsibly. And that's where, John ran into problems. John was, I don't know if you're familiar with the book and the movie Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yes, I think it was written by an English author, and it was very well put together.
Yeah.
A good film
on
on many different levels.
Yeah.
It did poke fun at them.
The George Clooney character in that was actually based on John Alexander. And the goats themselves, I mean, that was actually a joke, that was played on them by some of the people at Bragg. They were doing this stuff up at Fort Hollebred. And we sent them these, we sent them these goats. I later on, I said to John, I said, "You guys are getting all worked up about the fact that you could look at these goats and they'd fall down." I said, I really hate to tell you this. I said, go Google, and this is in the days of Google now, so you could find this stuff out, which you couldn't back then very easily. I said, look up myotonic goats, myotonic, goats, on YouTube, and your listeners could do this too for fun. The myotonic goat is a breed of goat that, for whatever reason, has a kind of a nerves damage in it, so that all you have to do is stare at it for a few minutes, and it goes into a seizure and collapses. This has nothing to do with you being a psychic. It has everything to do with the breed of goat. So myotonic goats, I mean, if you look them up, you'll see people, they stare at them for a few minutes, and the goat goes, there it goes, okay? That's what it was all about. It had absolutely nothing to do with psychic abilities. It was all just a stunt that was played with myotonic goats, for fun. Anyway, the psychotronic weapon stuff like remote viewing has absolutely no substance to it, period. It doesn't. What has substance to it is the use of the electromagnetic spectrum to influence the subconscious levels of human brain activity, and that's what my book Mind War is all about, and goes into great detail on how that can be done. And that has to do with all kinds of influences that we can bring to bear with the electromagnetic spectrum. But this is purely straightforward scientific stuff. It's not ooga booga stuff or this remote viewing nonsense or anything like that. And yes, I know there's a huge industry of people who are remote viewers today. What can I say? There's a new one born every minute.
But it does come up with some results. I mean, they do get some non-probability results, but mainly the so-called targeted individual are having serious problems with all these gigahertzes and 800 megahertzes all mixing from cell phone towers and being targeted with microwaves and things. There's a lot of abuse.
Yeah,
on
we've
that
got
level.
Sure, we've got a big. You're quite right. We live in a soup of electromagnetic mess today, and Mind War, the book, talks about this and points out that probably a lot more human problems than we're aware of are as a result of this sort of a mental chaos that we live in all the time, which leaves us, quite frankly, in a state of much more confusion than we need to be in, because it's attacking us at the subconscious level. It isn't attacking us because there's some guy who's maliciously doing it. It's attacking us simply because it's a sort of a big lightning storm going on down there that tends to scramble our perceptions of reality. When I was on one of my visits, to Fort Bragg, when I was going over this stuff, I told one of the generals there, look, if you want, I'll set up a classroom for you here that is a Faraday cage, that basically is shielded against this external radiation and electromagnetic stuff. And we'll create control devices, that release different kinds of brainwave frequencies into it, so you can actually dial up and dial down the concentration of anybody who's in the classroom. And you can, put alpha in there, or beta, or theta, or delta, and you can either send everybody to sleep, or you can have them pay attention, or whatever. And he thought it was a great idea, but he decided that it would cause too much of a problem, and probably some irate letters from people's mothers to their congressman or something. So he said, not just yet.
Well, this is very, very serious now. The scale of cell phone towers, 20 to 100 gigahertz in the public domain, every lamppost, every couple of meters, every.
I know. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, we shouldn't be doing this.
It's been forced on us.
Yeah. Yes, and it's way out of control. I don't think it isn't so much that it's giving people brain tumors unless they sleep on their cell phones, as much as it is just creating.
I have to say there's data which disputes that most seriously, and the test with this 5G stuff is in the gigahertz range, 20 gigs right into your head outside your house.
Yeah,
and it's bad news. This is causing a lot of damage to people.
No, I'm not contesting that at all. I'm saying we live in this very bad electromagnetic atmosphere here, and it's definitely unhealthy. But it hasn't really been mapped. As I said, it isn't something that is.
I think that's one of the
coherent.
problems.
It's something that's random.
The research
has
mess. Not been done yet. The FCC is pushing this through, and in every other country it's being pushed through very aggressively. They do not want the tests, it seems.
No, of course not. And as I said, this is a situation in which technology has really overrun, an intelligent examination into what effects it has on people. You can go out and find some very, very good studies as to the damage that can be done to people by exposure to these levels of electromagnetic radiation. But you're right, it simply hasn't overtaken the industries because people are so addicted to their cell phones that they don't care. They just...
Well, but I'm going to use my iPhone anyway. Is that not coupled with artificial intelligence? Is a reason why this is happening? They're predicting people's behaviors, buying habits, controlling them. AI, really serious threat, some people say.
Well, AI, artificial intelligence, is a slightly different topic, because that's talking about computers that ape the creative abilities of the human mind to process thinking.
Well, some would say they access the human mind. Some would say that they access our consciousness at a thought consciousness level, and there are companies.
They haven't done that yet. I've been keeping up with the research on that. They haven't done that yet.
I beg to differ on that. I beg to differ on that.
The human brain is a lot more complicated than that, and they've got a long way to go to do that. They're basically in kindergarten, where trying to figure out how the human brain functions on the level of how it actually creates and processes thoughts. The speeds that you have within your consciousness are much vaster and huger than anything that even the most advanced computers can do, because they're basically one foot after another data processing things, no matter how fast
Well, what
they
about
function.
the cyborgs? I mean, there's a Boston Dynamics, I believe it is, interfacing pig brains, reusing brains. Neurotech, Elon Musk is talking about interfacing the brain's neural tissue with machines, and you don't actually know the difference between moving your arm or moving the wing of a robot aircraft run by an ex-dead soldier.
Well, we're doing that. We're doing that already, to the extent point that we can find motor nerves, and we can connect them to artificial limbs and things for people who've been amputees and so on. And we're gradually working towards, for example, and I sort of pay attention to this because I suffer from macular degeneration, so my eyesight is going on me. And through stem cell research and the rest of it, they'll be working to a point where the photoreceptors of your eyes can be replaced with either grown ones, through cloning, or with artificial ones. 100 years from now, we'll probably have completely automated, replaced eyes so that everything functions right, that's have 20/20 vision for everybody. And we'll also probably have artificial teeth that they pull out all your imperfect ones and just replace them with
just don't take sugar. A better diet would help there. Yeah.
So I mean,
there are people arguing that is happening now. AI cyborgs. These cyborgs are being, paraded on stage. There's a Japanese one was on British television last night. They're making them look very nice.
Well, there's a lot of cute robots around.
Yeah.
We have this outfit in Washington D.C. called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is sort of a madhouse of crazy inventors run by the Defense Department. And I've been over at DARPA a few times. It's always fun because they do a lot of work with robots, and if you're walking through the halls there, as often as not, you'll see some scientist walking down the hall with some kind of a weird robot trundling along after him, that he's working on and stuff. So it's cute. So yes, we're very far along in the area of imitative and useful robots, but you can get these things, from Sharper Image, for that matter. A lot of household robots you can get to vacuum your floors and the rest of it. So a lot of the stuff is
there's some
coming along pretty well, but it's still utilitarian. It doesn't have that creative difference, that unique spark that makes a human being a human being. This is what, for want of a better word, if we haven't delved into enough complicated subjects so far in this, let's bring up the word soul.
Well, exactly.
Thing that this is the metaphysical thing that makes you something other than just a piece of meat. And I wrote a book on that, and it's called Mind Star, MINDSTAR. And it's a big book, and it's sort of a manual of the soul, much more detailed than we could go into in a conversation like this.
Are we dealing with complex number space where you exist differently to your physical 3D body, the ionosphere?
Well, of course,
what are we talking
we
about?
live in we interface. We are meat machines that interface with what I describe as the objective universe, which is the four-dimensional one out there that has to do with length, width, depth, and comparative distances. So we're working with a four-dimension objective universe out there, which is sort of the physical universe of matter and energy and antimatter and anti-energy out there. But there is what Rod Serling called in the Twilight Zone, there's a fifth dimension, and that's the human conscious entity, which is detached from all this and able to perceive it and make decisions concerning it and interact with it.
But that's crucial. That's crucial. It's the perceiving.
Yes.
It's the perceiving.
That's
it's
the
us
soul. That's the fifth
doing
dimension.
that.
That's the real Miles, and that's the real Michael Aquino. Other than that, your physical shell that's operating recording devices and me on the phone right now, this is just like an automobile that we're a driver driving, okay? But anyway, as I said, this whole subject of the soul, the metaphysical dimension of your existence, is the subject of that book, Mind Star. So if your listeners want to really get into that, I'd suggest they pick up a copy of that, and it'll be a guidebook like one they've never seen before, MindStar, that is basically an exploration of this whole concept of the human soul, which very few people historically have had the ability to go into and delve into, but I happen to have been able to get past, the curtain, so to speak, on this.
Well, what about...
Consider this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people talking about this stuff. Dr.
Sure.
Robert Duncan, as Project Soulcatcher.
When most people think about the soul, when it's brought up as an object of conversation, they immediately sort of dovetail in the old religious myths. Oh, well, this is the thing that God puts in you, or that, Jesus takes up to heaven, or the devil takes out to hell, or whatever. Or if you're a Buddhist or a Hindu that sort of rockets around on the Great Mandala and comes back in a centipede, or a life insurance salesman, depending upon how good or bad you've been this time around.
I would beg not to insult a millipede. I mean,
so I mean, most people have this very comic book idea of what the soul is.
Are you talking about Marvel comics? Marvel comic books?
Yeah, well, just
there's a lot of stuff
books.
there.
I mean, silly stuff. It's very.
Doesn't the Pentagon spend a lot of money on those movies?
A very silly one. Yeah. So if you really want to understand the soul, and I go into this, I said in excruciating detail in MindStar, the people who had their shit together on this were the ancient Egyptians. And I mean, they really went at this in an amazing way. They broke it down into 8 separate components of your personality, that function in different ways in an interrelated way. So you've got there are 8 Mileses, you might say.
Oh my God, it's bad enough with one.
Into a single one. So if you want to learn about all your 8 people, the 8 real Mileses, they're all in there in MindStar, and you can go meet them all. But this is the level to which the ancient Egyptians delved into this and really nailed it down. It's absolutely fascinating. I spent decades and decades, in original research in Egyptology, going through this stuff. And once you begin to get a click on it, it's absolutely astounding. A very good author in this field, other than myself. René Schwaller-Dlubics, who's responsible for what they call the symbolic or symbolism approach to Egyptological study. He's written a number of books, The Temple in Man, The Temple of Man. He had a very bright wife by the name of Aisha Schwaller-Dlubics, who wrote a series of 2 books in a novel form called Herbak, Her-Bak. And if your listeners want a good introduction in language that isn't going to glaze their eyeballs to this whole field of how to understand the soul, I would say pick up a copy of Herbak and take a look at it. You'll find it's very educational, and if you want, you can go on to her husband's stuff there.
How do you spell that briefly?
Her-BAK, Herbak. There are 2 volumes of it. It's published by Inner Traditions in paperback, I believe, and so it's available on Amazon. And her husband's stuff, René Schwaller-Dlubics, Lubicz is his last name. All of his works are there, but that's really high-powered stuff. And as I said, if your listeners start delving into his stuff, I promise you they'll get glazed eyeballs in a hurry. So that's why I recommend that you start out with the Herbak until you kind of get your feet on the ground there. But that'll give you an introduction to how the Egyptians understood reality and the mysteries of the soul, of the metaphysical existence of your consciousness. Consider this, that most people, and they don't really think about this, but they have a very fundamental decision to make. Is your life going to stop when you physically die or not? If it is, and there's no heaven, and there's no hell, and there's no afterlife, and there's no nothing, it's just a big black sack, then you have absolutely no reason to have any kind of a higher morality concerning your existence other than what it seems to make sense with regard to this life. So if you're going to behave good or bad, it has to do with people that you run into and meet, and countries and things that you would meet while you're an incarnated being. However, if you, like the Egyptians, if you identify a much higher and more sophisticated existence, to which this is just training wheels on a bicycle, then your behavior in this life is not at all what determines the worth of yourself as a being. It's the entire education process of learning who you are, because you're about to enter a much larger universe, a little bit like Luke Skywalker and the Force, you know. Once your physical body decomposes and stops metabolizing, that's just the start. And the Egyptians were very frank about this and said, yep, it's just the start. And that's where I'm going to add my voice there and say, if you read Mindstar, you'll see exactly why that's the case. And I don't use $500 words to explain it either. So
well, in the last few minutes of this part, people have heard Tim Refat stuff. There's other stuff from Aleister Crowley and complex number space, hell space, C space, Argon diagram, the symbology of the church. So much of that is in the great artwork and presentations of the church and other institutions. They're pointing to all these strange places, and some people have interpretations of them. I mean, what do you feel is the bee's knees about all that? There's the psyops. We have the New Age stuff, which is all a psyop and all that. What else is really involved there?
First of all, with regard to conventional churches and conventional religion, this is just basically the scrap heap of the stuff that's left over from that El superstition from the Bronze Age. And you can practically, and a lot of it is very pretty. You know, we've got some very beautiful cathedrals. And
but a lot of people have been burned at stakes about stuff like that.
I know, and I'm saying I know, and it's a tremendous waste and a tremendous tragedy, because it's all bullshit. All right, you go into St. Peter's and you stand there, and in the square, or you stand out in front of St. Paul's in London. This is fake. It's fake. It's built on sand. It's nothing to it except that it was a good psyop device to control lots of people for lots of years, and it caused a lot of deaths over the years for the same reason, and exterminated a lot of populations in South America and all the rest of it. So I'm saying that if you really want to get into metaphysics, there's only one way to go, where you aren't going to get aren't going to get screwed up, and that's in the direction of the ancient Egyptians, as I've done. And I say that as somebody who's explored everything, all these alternatives. I've been.
Well, what about the story, the most ancient story? It's been mentioned, the most ancient story, our ancient origins. I mean, before we were brought here. What about that in the last few minutes? Where did we come from?
Okay. We've got our present, to go into a little archaeology here. We've had our present level of brain coherence as incarnate beings for about the last 100,000 years at least. And later research by Cremo and others, who's another bright person you get your hooks into.
Devolution. He's done a lot of good books. As Cremo.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, this guy in the forbidden archaeology area. I mean, he's smart son of a bitch. Okay, and he's principled. I know a lot of these guys. Peter Lavenda, Cremo, and a lot of them they're like me. I mean, they do this stuff not because they're trying to sell you their underwear, but because we're curious and we want to know what the hell is really going on. That's been my motivating factor. I'm not trying to, sell you my shorts or anything like that. I'm simply saying that I've been a curious person in my life, and I wanted to find out what's really going on. And to the extent that I could find out, then I would try to write it up in a book as coherently as I could and put the book out there. I have maybe just a few years left to live before my body falls apart. I'm kind of old and sick at this point, but I've got 17 books out there, and I'm satisfied that I pretty well got these subject matters that I looked into dicked really good. And I can't write anything unless I can have it make sense to me when I read it. So I don't try to use ooga booga language or silly ass words that mean nothing. If I've got something to say, then I say it. So if people want to see how I attack these various concepts that we've discussed today, you'll find the selection of them. Just go to something like Amazon, look up Michael Aquino as an author, and you'll see all these books there, and then you can kind of look around between them and say, okay, I'm interested in that. I don't give a shit about that. And then you can sort of take your pick and go through it. And I think people will find out that basically some pretty sound stuff, that we've gotten into. Like we've touched on a whole variety of stuff here today, but these are big questions, and it's very hard to nail them down in just an hour or two.
When we're closing in the last 5 minutes, okay, you've said that this is all bullshit, blah, blah, blah. What do you feel those devotees of those belief systems or those systems who've spent their whole lives in all of this, and then they just hear it's all just bullshit? I mean, what do you feel? I mean, they may say unkind things about you. What I mean?
Well, I'm not saying.
How would they address
about
that?
Them, except that they're misguided. They're basically they're working from a position of factual incorrect ignorance, and that's. I mean, what can I say? They're believing fairy tales. I mean, when I was a kid, I believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny.
Now, hold on here. Now you're really just getting silly. I mean, Santa Claus is real.
Yeah, well,
for a
I'm
start.
just saying that I believed in those things up to a point where
we've got to keep some credibility here.
They didn't make sense anymore. And when they didn't make sense anymore, I discarded them. And I did the same thing with the silly-ass myths of things like Judeo-Christianity and Islam and Hinduism. I can't help that there are millions and millions and billions of people around the planet who still believe this stuff, but I can say it's crap. And the evidence that it is crap is right out there in plain sight for anyone who actually wants to take a look at it. The book of mine that looks at the organized histories of some of these religions and what frauds they are is Illuminank, ILLUMINANX. And this was a book that I wrote after some time that I spent with the Rosicrucians in San Jose, which I had hoped would be perhaps another interesting outfit to explore stuff, and it turned out to be just more fraud like anything else. But while I was at it, I did a major study of organized religion generally and wrote that book. So people who take a look at Illuminank will be able to not only see a lot of this religious propaganda that's just sort of laid bare, but also see how you can construct a rational religion from truth and true facts as the Egyptians did. And when I get around to the end of Illuminank, one of the things that comes up is Hairbach. And I say, if you've got to this point and your world has exploded in front of you, then pick up this goddamn book, Hairbach. I don't make any money from it. Schwaller de Lopes wrote it because she wanted to make her husband's 20 or 30 years of work in Egypt intelligible to people who who couldn't read hieroglyphics in the original.
Yeah, I mean, so what about
and read it? And
Zechariah Sitchin, the ancient Sumerian texts? I mean, what about those sort of things that people can look at? Yeah.
It's wrong. It's wrong. I mean, you go back in the
which is wrong. The Zechariah Sitchin versions, of course, is about quite a few books.
The old fairy tales that you get from Sumeria and Akkadian and all the other Bronze Age stuff going way back then into the Sanskrit and so on. It's gibberish. It's wrong. The Egyptians got it right. These other people had their heads up their ass. I don't know how to put it any better than that.
Well, last time we got cut off after I think we hit an hour, so I don't want to have another cut off. So finally, Michael, thank you very much indeed. We got 2 hours out of this, and very interesting. Tim Refat, of course, is doing his thing. There's other people doing their thing. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of stuff to talk about. and think about, get your head out of the box or out of the checkerboard, so to speak.
If there's, as I said, if there's anything that your listeners want to take away from this, do not let yourself get suckered or fooled or sold a bill of goods. My old friend Grace Slick, singer of the Jefferson Airplane, said, Mike, everybody wants to sell you their shorts, okay? Don't buy everybody else's shorts, all right? Be very critical. Be very careful about what you read. And if it doesn't make sense to you, go find something that does. Don't accept bullshit just because somebody else tells you that you're supposed to accept it as bullshit.
Well, that's fairly direct, to the point. And
that's also one of the great services you're doing with your project, if I don't mind saying so. People like you who get out and ask these questions and basically jam people up against the wall and say, okay, let's examine reality and let's see if what you've got to say for yourself. You're doing a great service here. Maybe you don't have all the answers, Miles, but you sure as shit ask the right questions. There's a hell of a lot to be said for that.
Well, thank you. From the basis bunker, ein Bunker, in the middle of Wiltshire on a rainy day in the middle of the summer.
Okay.
2019. I'll say good night, and may your God go with you. Is that right?
Okay, Miles. Bye-bye.
All the best. Good night.